So that's but I just ended up being in the practice room for 3 hours because I couldn't sleep.
Okay, let's get started for the day. Good afternoon, welcome back. I hope you've had a good weekend. We are at 8 out of 10. We only have 3 full weeks left. This week we have a new set of 3 theories to go over. Next week and week 10, our availability is also going to be a little bit different because we have Memorial Day, and I will also be traveling, trying to give you some space to work through your second application paper and gear up for the final one. So a couple things. You likely received an email today. I've been pretty busy and jumping around a lot of places because we have a candidate for a new position in public relations who will hopefully be filling and having a new public relations program. An instructor for public relations who you might have received through email is doing a presentation at 2 p.m. today, so right after class. So if you're available and interested in watching Michael Nitz, who will be sharing a bit of his background in research in public relations, or that's a program that's interesting to you, I definitely recommend checking that out. There were a few late submissions that I got for the first application paper. So I'm finishing up and working through those. And after that, I will unmute and have all of your comments and grades up. So my goal is to have that back to you and ready by Wednesday. So just a slight delay with some late submissions. And so I will be able to get all that posted for you very soon. So thanks for your patience as I'm working through that. As you're gearing up for the second application paper, if you've got questions, if you want to send a draft, or you're having challenges as you're working through the assignment, just let me know. Or you're just seeking ideas, I'm happy to talk through things to know in preparing for and thinking about that second paper. Again, it's just like the first one, but you'll pick some of the theories that we've talked about since the first week of the term and use one of those to explore another communication artifact of choice. So with that being said, one last exciting announcement, we've got a couple of major events coming up. We have both the Spring Symposium, where students are sharing their research background. Is there anybody in this class here who's involved in the Spring Symposium? Okay. So if there's other folks that you know of who are involved, or you just want to support other students, just know that that's coming up. We also have, I'm forgetting on the exact name, but it's so I know Rent is part of it. There's the Arts Fest. Yes, that's the name. I was going to say arts and culture. Yeah. So we have Arts Fest coming up too, which is awesome. There's going to be a lot of great stuff, including the productive rent. There's going to be a variety of food, beverages, student art, work. So just know that that's coming up this week and a lot of exciting events ahead. So I wanted to put in a plug for those things, knowing we're at a pretty fun time in the quarter. So in just a minute, we'll be hearing from Jessica, who will be talking with us about relational dialectics theory. So this is a pretty interesting one that ties itself pretty closely to our relationships and the ways that we have to navigate many of the contradictions that we feel in our relationships. For instance, sometimes we want to both feel close and deeply connected to somebody, but we also want our space. right? So we try to figure out how we negotiate and manage the seesaw that can go one extreme or the other in our communication with others. So we'll be hearing from Jessica today, Kiana on Wednesday on cultivation theory, which is a more media-focused theory on sort of the influence and ability of media to impact how we think about a variety of issues. And then on Friday, we'll hear from James on cultural studies. Cultural studies is a very broad approach that's great in analyzing media or analyzing a variety of social and political topics that relates to how we shape and understand a variety of identities and experiences. And then after that, we just have two more theories, unit group and feminist standpoint theory. I will also, in a little bit, be posting an extra credit opportunity. We've been going over a lot of theories, including a lot of the ones in your book. However, one thing that I'll give you the opportunity to do if you want to receive extra credit is to pick a theory that we have not had the chance to go over and to share and talk a little bit about what you've learned from that one. So look forward to that prompt coming up shortly. Again, we are covering a lot of theories in this class, but there's no way we can get every single one. So just know that there is more than this that we could cover for weeks and weeks if we wanted to. I'd also recommend if there are theories that especially stand out to you as interesting, like topic areas, like interpersonal, like media, that we have a lot of courses in communication that focus on some of those areas of study too. So last class, we heard from Haley, who got us thinking about communication accommodation theory, had a great visual way of representing and getting us thinking about CAT, right? Communication accommodation being the idea that whether intentionally or not, we are modifying and adjusting the ways that we communicate with other people in an effort to meet that other person and their needs. For instance, if we're around a young child, then we might choose to talk more slowly and enthusiastically to better understand and be understood by that child, right? So communication accommodation theory gets at the ways that we alter and adjust our own communication. We also did a little activity last Friday where I was just asking you to start to brainstorm for your second application paper. So I do recommend, if you haven't already done some brainstorming, to think about an artifact and theory that's interesting to you that you might want to focus on, since that will be due a week from Wednesday. For today, we'll hear from Jessica on relational dialectics. We'll talk a little bit about relational dialectics, and we'll also discuss some of its practical utility. Again, recognizing that this theory really relates closely to the tensions and challenges that we have to negotiate in many of our practical relationships with others. So, with all of that in mind, Jessica, I believe I have your slides all downloaded, ready to go.
Thank you. Okay. Wait, weird.
Yeah.
This is like weirdly.
Yeah, it's a bit of a fun time to position it exactly where you want it. So, you're welcome to mess with it.
Okay.
All right.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Durfee, and I'm doing my presentation on relational dialectics theory today. Right. What do I do?
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Got it.
Click or right there.
So what is relational dialectics theory? Basically, it's a theory that says that it maintains that people in close personal relationships experience ongoing tension, struggles, and interplay between contradictory impulses. The two sayings, absence makes the heart grow fonder, also coexist with the out of sight, out of mind. Also, like a female college student would be like, well, I'm kind of like seeing him, but we're not, serious. Those coexist together. These lovely ladies, Leslie Baxter and Barbara Montgomery, proposed this theory in the late 1980s, 1988, and they actually ended up writing a book together after they discovered that they were basically studying the same communication theory together. The approaches that are used of contradictions are monologic, dualistic, and dialectic. So as you can see, monologic is framing the contradiction as either or. So whether like the relationship is either close or distant, in other words, the two parts of the contradictions are mutually exclusive. And as you move towards one extreme, you retreat from the other. The second is dualistic, framing the contradiction as two separate entities, somewhat unrelated to each other. So dualistic thinkers might choose to evaluate them separately, rating how close each one feels compared to the other. It allows from the idea that relationships may evaluate differently on scales at different times. And dialectic approach is framing contradictions as both and, And so as you can see, it bounces back and forth a lot, which is really neat. It maintains the multiple points of view play off one another. Although a contradiction involves two opposing poles, still, as you can see, there's A and B, it still expands beyond the two poles. And Baxter Montgomery said, dialectic thinking is not directed towards a search for happy mediums of compromise and balance, but instead focuses on the messier, less logical, and more inconsistent unfolding practices of the moment. Some assumptions of relational dialectics theory: relationships are not linear, as we know, they can be kind of complex. Relational life is characterized by change. Change is a great thing. Contradiction is the fundamental fact of relational life. Communication, very important, is central to organizing and negotiating relational contradictions, and us as human beings are choice makers. So building the tension, there has to be tension. It is essential in any and every relationship. The totality acknowledges the interdependence of people in the relationship, of us, of our soul person, of who we are. The contradiction, as we know, is a central feature of the dialectic approach, refers to the opposition. I was married for 5 years. I knew my ex-husband now for 11. And from our different families and backgrounds, there has been a lot of opposition that has transpired from that. The motion is the processual nature of relationships and their change over time. So because I have known Adam for 11 years, from meeting him to maybe we should date to I kind of like you, like, hey, you want to get married? I guess so. And then things kind of hit the fan wonky to divorce. And now we're actually really good friends afterwards. And seeing that growth and that motion through that 11 years is really interesting. The praxis is the choice, as we have, of the choice-making capacity of humans. So these are the basic relational dialectics contradictions. We have the autonomy and connection, refers to our stimulus desires to be independent of our significant others and to find intimacy with them. So like wanting to like be in the same room together, but not necessarily doing the same thing. Like he wants to play video games, I want to play solitaire on my phone. Openness and protection, it focuses on our conflicting desires to be both open and vulnerable, revealing personal information to our relational partners and to be strategic and protective in our communication. And we have novelty as well, and predictability. It refers to the conflict between the comfort and stability and the excitement of change. And to go with this last one, I really like the example I'm going to use is Mr. and Mrs. Incredible. Bob and Helen Parr, they're having this tiff. It basically was showing us that Mr. Incredible is really struggling with his identity. And he basically, Helen finds a piece of rubble on his shoulder. And
Victoria, I'll help you out easily.
yeah, okay. Is this what you're nervous about?
Oh, no, I just, sometimes the video doesn't work or the link doesn't. It's broken link sometimes, so
Okay.
if it doesn't.
So basically what happened in the scene, or right before it, I should say, Frozone and Mr. Incredible were out listening to the police scanner. They ended up saving a bunch of people from a fiery, currently burning building that accidentally landed into a jewelry store. It's pretty fun. But he comes back home and there happens to be a little speck, and Helen just really wants, really wants him to be a family man and to not blow their cover and everything. So this is kind of their tiff that they have.
Well, it was just a little workout. Just to stay loose.
You know how I feel about that, Bob. Darn you, we can't blow cover
The
again.
building was coming down anyway.
What? You knocked down a building?
It was on fire, structurally unsound. It was coming down anyway.
Tell me you haven't been listening to the police scanner again.
Look, I performed a public service. You act like that's a bad
It
thing.
is a bad thing, Bob. Uprooting our family again so you can relive the glory days is a very bad thing.
Reliving the glory days is better than acting like they didn't happen.
Yes, they happened. But this, our family, is what's happening now, Bob. And you're missing this. I can't believe.
We get the idea, right? I don't know where my slide is.
Be on the PowerPoint, click on the PowerPoint icon at the bottom there.
Here.
Yes. And one more. Yep,
Okay, so
perfect.
that's the example I have. And why I think this theory is important is because it shows that relationships are complex. How as we as individuals and partners in relationships strive to have progression and meaningful connection that is built over time, even with all the contradictions. And this is just a quote from Baxter Montgomery that I like saying that how it's a dynamic not of contradictions, a ceaseless interplay between contrary or opposing tendencies. That's my observation.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I really like your video example in helping us to think about how, in a lot of contexts, including in married relationship, right? You're navigating those contradictions, self-disclosure, and the anxieties that come with wanting to present our whole selves, figuring out what parts of ourselves we don't want to share with other people, right? That context of Mr. Incredible not really wanting to give up his status in crime fighting and all of that, while at the same time juggling those other responsibilities. I think it's a really interesting one. So really good work here in getting us thinking about this theory, using examples that help us to think about why this theory matters, right? Our relationships are messy, and so this theory really helps us to think about and wade through that messiness and complication of those relationships, where at times what we want and what we feel like makes for a positive relationship can look really different. So we'll be talking a little bit about relational dialectics theory, and I have another example to show you. One of my favorite TV shows is Schitt's Creek, and there's a relationship between two characters on the show that I think is interesting and a metaphor that's being used to describe their relationship and about the character David here on the right in regards to his character sexuality and how that impacts their relationship as a way of recognizing and dealing with the confusion and tensions of that relationship. So I'll show that in just a little bit. So RDT, relational dialectics, if we think back to Aristotle and the Greeks, right? If you had to read the rhetoric at any point, rhetoric is the counterpoint to dialectic. In other words, rhetoric is about persuasion. It's about convincing people to buy the used car, right? And rhetoric is oftentimes concerned with making the weaker argument stronger. That's a pushback that a lot of Greeks had against the use of rhetoric, that will use rhetoric to get people to believe or do things that aren't necessarily correct. We see a lot of discussions about that as it relates to the accuracy of factual data. And dialectic is more concerned with dialogue, right? You can think about the usage of the word dia or dialogue as synonymous with dialectic. The argument that the Greeks had is that dialectic helps us to reach the truth, or helps us to reach conclusions and learn from one another through conversation, through questioning, through really trying to understand and get to know one another, through having interesting debates and discussion. You know, you're up until 2 in the morning talking about a whole range of topics. That's what dialectic is concerned with, is how we learn from each other through our communication in two-way dialogue. In this way, our relationships in navigating that dialectic and navigating those conversations bring about some unique challenges and tensions that we experience. It's sociocultural, right? Looking at our social relationships. It's interpersonal, looking primarily between two people. So this wouldn't really be one used in a larger group setting. This is a really good candidate if you find that there's an example, for instance, from a TV show, episode, or film of dialectic or tension between two characters, or how those two characters navigate their relationships. That's a good thing to focus on. For instance, there are a lot of TV shows that have the kind of will they, won't they relationships between two characters. Jim and Pam in The Office, Ross and Rachel and Friends, right? A lot of the tension and excitement that we have from watching those shows is watching the way that the relationships change. In fact, a lot of creators of shows actually say that it's more fun for them to keep the will they, won't they thing going between two characters as long as possible, because once they get together, it's boring, right? So oftentimes we get a lot of enjoyment out of the drama and tension that characters have as they're navigating the ins and outs. And while we think about this a lot in the context of like romantic relationships and the steps they might be involved in, it happens a lot in terms of friendships and other social relationships that we choose as well. For instance, when I was growing up, I had a friend who was my next door neighbor and wanted to come to my house all the time to play the GameCube games that I had, right? And it was kind of fun for a while, but he kept coming after school every single day and I had other things I wanted to do. And I started to get bored and frustrated that he was coming over every trying to establish a boundary there is an example of those challenges with relational dialectics too. So we negotiate that in a lot of our relationships. As Jessica brought up, it comes from Leslie Baxter and Barbara Montgomery. Again, very interested in how we socially form relationships with other people in an interpersonal and applied way. Building off of some of the ideas that Jessica brought up here with regard to how relationships develop and change, it deals with this idea of monologic, dualistic, and dialectic. If you think back to the visualness they used, I thought that was a really good way to think about it. If monologic is just a line, right, and dualistic is kind of like two parallel lines, the idea that there are these like hills and valleys, intersecting parts and lines and so on, is an example of how multiple points of view play off of each other in a dialectic context, right? So in this way, there are two individuals involved in that relationship, and the overlap in how that relationship develops and changes over time is an example of how the unique perspectives and experiences that two people have create a very different dynamic than people on their own in an intrapersonal context, right? One kind of classical historical example is probably one of the most famous romantic comedies. If you've ever seen the film When Harry Met Sally, right? The premise of the film is that it follows two characters over the course of a prolonged period of time. I think it's over 10 years, right? And in one stage of their lives, Harry is engaged to somebody and is involved. Sally is single, right? And they're driving together on a road trip. At another point in their lives, she's engaged, he's maybe interested, but over the whole film, right? They're not quite at the right place at the right time with each other. They're at very different kind of relationship stages with other people. And so the way that the relationships that we have changed based on the stages that we're at in our lives, what we want out of our social relationships and so on, the ebbs and flows we experience are a big part of this too, right? For instance, for many of us, we might have had close friendships in middle or high school. It says moving on to college, right? Maybe some of those relationships have drifted apart, or maybe we've reconnected with older friends. So some of those changes are things that the relational contradictions deal with too. So I want to go over some of these 4 contradictions, and I also will be having us do an activity a bit where I'm asking us to divide up and to think about each of these contradictions in a little bit more detail, right? So one of these contradictions deals with this idea of autonomy versus connection. And I should add too that where we fall on these spectrums can differ depending on the person, depending on the cultural background, and it can also change depending on the day or on our mood, right? If you're a more introverted person and you feel kind of socially maxed out, you're probably going to drift much harder to the other. The first contradiction deals with the idea that we both like to be independent, but we like to be our own people. This is especially true in more individualistic cultures like the United States and Australia. And at the same time, we like to feel that there's connection, that there's joint action or camaraderie with other people, right? So one of the biggest things that we have to juggle and figure out is if we're a more introverted person, how we still maintain some social needs and social relationships, but still have the time to do our own thing, right? Oftentimes more introverted folks say that they recharge by being alone and they spend or use energy by spending time with other people. It's not that introverted people do not want to have friendships or social relationships or spend time with others, right? It's that can at times feel like a draining experience, especially if it happens over a prolonged period of time. Versus more extroverted people really enjoy connection, right? And sort of charge up by spending time with other people. Maybe they drain themselves by spending time alone, but also recognize that there are times where they have to be alone, they have to take on tasks alone, or maybe enjoy taking a little bit of a breather. So introversion, extroversion is one element. We can also think about culture and demographics of a location, right? Here in rural Oregon, it's more likely that we'll feel more autonomy. We might more actively pursue clubs, activities, or organizations for connection, or we might already be involved in those through groups that we're a part of. right? So that's one element that shapes our experience. One thing that I think is an interesting contrast is thinking about upbringing and experience too. Again, I have an older sister, but I grew up alone when she had already kind of gone off to college. And so I grew up in a very small household. My partner grew up in a very large household. She's the oldest of 6 siblings. And so we have kind of different desires for like how active and involved it is in our house, right? So that difference from our cultural background and upbringing can shape this too. Another idea here is this question of openness versus protection, right? And this is a contradiction that goes all the way back to a lot of the theories we've been talking about since the beginning of the course. If we think about things like uncertainty reduction theory, how we navigate and choose to emote and express ourselves more openly as relationships continue, we use more nonverbal gestures, relationships can be more lopsided, right? Openness is something that tends to come through self-disclosure. Think about social penetration theory and the onion, right? We reveal more of our layers and values and beliefs. And at the same time, we don't want to be hurt, right? Sometimes we're fearful of self-disclosing, we're oversharing, or providing information to other people about us that might end up hurting our relationship, or meaning that they use that information in a negative or hurtful way, right? We think about like some of the worst examples in like middle school, right? Where we keep a secret with a friend, and then for whatever reason, because it's middle school, you and that friend hate each other the next week, and your friend decides that they're going to tell all the secrets and say, oh, so-and-so like so-and-so, right? We are fearful at times of if a relationship changes or we don't trust the person that we're working with, that they'll share private information. There's also this feeling, a metaphor that's used to describe relationships as investment, right? The idea here being that one investing or putting time into a relationship through openness and through disclosure might cause that relationship and all the work that went into it to not feel worthwhile. So that's another challenge that we struggle with as we're navigating our relationships. There's also a question here of novelty versus predictability, right? Novelty refers to the idea that something is new or exciting, right? Especially in the context of like a romantic or dating relationship, there's what people oftentimes refer to as a spark, right? In the early stages, you become really interested and invested in the other person. There's a lot of excitement there at that early stage, right? And over time, you and that other person fall into a pattern where you feel like you're going through the same motions, you're talking about the same topic. Eventually, it feels like your relationship isn't really going anywhere, right? So we at times navigate that type of tightrope as well. Sometimes people in relationships that have a lot of history behind them will find new ways to create novelty or innovation. For example, maybe it's doing a trip, right? Trying to go somewhere new, or incorporating moving into a new space as a way of adding novelty to relationships. If you were like me and growing up, you watched SpongeBob a lot, right? There was an episode that I thought was really funny where the character Squidward finally gets to go to this like location where there's a bunch of people like him, where he gets to do all the things day to day that he wants to do. And it kind of does this montage where over the course of him being there, he has this smile that suddenly turns into a frown because he gets tired of like living the life he wanted to live over and over and doing the same routine over and over again. That's a challenge, right? Of novelty versus predictability. Feeling like over time, even if we like our friendships and our relationships, humans as pattern-seeking people lose that feeling kind of instinctual joy or response of adrenaline that we get, right? Part of why a lot of people get fatigued when like the 25th MCU movie comes out and it's overall the very same formula. And then there's this question of public versus private, right? Public versus private being this question of what information is available and what do you choose to share with a large group of people? What do you choose to hold in or share with a very small number of people? Again, that ties pretty closely to uncertainty reduction theory thinking back to the onion and the ways that we share different layers of our identities with other people. So we might think, for instance, about what we choose to share on social media as an example of what fits in that line between public and private. So there are a variety of different strategies that we can take in order to address or deal with a tension that we experience in our relationships, right? One of these is known as the idea of cyclical alteration. Through this method, we alternate between one extreme or the other. For example, to experience the sort of transition between autonomy versus connectedness, maybe we decide that for 1 week, one member of a relationship is going to do a solo trip and spend a week somewhere else. And then maybe after that, you and that person are going to do a weekend camping trip together, right? You're alternating between those extremes to try to get each of those plates spun and each of those needs fulfilled. That can be effective in terms of managing and feeling like either side is being met, although sometimes it can feel like you're kind of bouncing between sides, and that can be a source of stress. Segmentation involves splitting off certain portions of your life or experience based on certain needs. One example of this is, I know a lot of people who will create a specific social media account that's like a professional account, like a LinkedIn, right? And then an account that is a little bit more exclusive and focused. So through segmentation, we might decide what profile we're going to share that public information with, and what profile is going to be a little bit more private and closed. Selection generally means that we are choosing one extreme or one side to focus on. For instance, maybe we're at a time in our lives where we're experiencing a lot of stress, we're about to graduate, we're applying for jobs, we don't know where we're going to end up next in life. Therefore, having predictability in a relationship like a friendship is a good thing. Having a friend that you talk to every week for coffee is a source of stability amid all the chaos. So sometimes we choose one side of the tension and stick to it because we know that it will help us overall. And then integration would be an attempt to try to bridge what we see as the tension and divide. For instance, one method of integration might be that you and a close friend decide, you know what, we're going to go to and do a workout together, but maybe after that, we're going to try to go somewhere new, where you have both the predictability as well as the novelty at the same time. So navigating those types of tensions in the context of the relationship is another way that we can think about decisions. So there is some critique of relational dialectics theory. One of the critiques here is this question of parsimony. There are a lot of contradictions that we deal with in our relationships. This theory mainly focuses on those four that we talked about. And so there's just a bunch of other things that we're having to consider. A question of freedom versus security, a question of tradition versus newness, right? There are other elements and ways to measure some of the challenges that we deal with in our relationships. This is also not really an empirical theory. You can't really quantify what autonomy versus connectedness means, because it can mean very different things to very different people, right? And another critique is just this theory is a little bit complicated in how it lays out some of the tensions and elements of a relationship and how to navigate those elements of a relationship too. So this theory is useful. It's got a lot going for it in terms of thinking about how we manage our interpersonal relationships, but it definitely has generated a bit of critique there. They recently forced me to switch it. And they recently forced me to make it look. It's not very great combo. So the example I wanted to share is just a short clip from the TV show Schitt's Creek. The two characters, Stevie and David, right, have been involved with each other, but there was a question about their relationship and about the status of the relationship, especially because David has kind of indicated, right, that he is sort of, not heterosexual, and there's questions about sort of how sexuality figures into their relationship and the direction of their relationship.
So, just to be clear, I'm a red wine drinker. Okay, cool. I only drink red wine. Okay. And up until last night, I was under the impression that you too only drank red wine. But I guess I was wrong.
I see where you're going with this. I do drink red wine, but I also drink white wine. And I've been known to sample the occasional rosé. And a couple summers back, I tried a Merlot. It used to be a Chardonnay,
Oh,
which got a bit complicated.
okay. Yeah, so you're just really open to all wines.
I like the wine and not the label. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. This is just very new to me, so as long as you didn't roll over and cry yourself to sleep with regret, then we're good, right?
No, I absolutely did that. Just wept for hours in the dark. I say we go with this one, it's the biggest.
So interestingly, people have actually, folks that are like in the bisexual or pansexual umbrella have actually used that metaphor to come out to friends and family. Kind of an interesting way to describe and navigate relational dialectics, right? Because Stevie's talking about this question of novelty, about where they're at, the challenges of navigating and figuring out things related to sexuality, and also sort of having to explain and talk about and navigate tensions in their relationship and using that as a way to describe and navigate that, right? Oftentimes we like to talk a little around or use metaphor or other ways of describing relationships and trying to gauge from the other person how we can negotiate some of those tensions in our relationships. So what I want us to do now is I'm going to have 4 different groups. And what I'd like each group to do is with one of these assigned contradictions and tensions to navigate, I want you to take some time to describe this tension in your own words, drawing from the things we've talked about here. Take some time to talk a little bit about, within your groups, how you manage or deal with this tension in your own relationships, right? And then an example or situation in which somebody would need to navigate tension like this in their relationship. You think about a hypothetical example or practical example that might have emerged from the things that you all chose to talk about together. So we've got a larger group today. It looks like we've got 3. Okay, perfect. So we'll do 4, 2 groups of 4 and 2 groups of 5. Okay, so we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So group 1, autonomy versus connection. Group 2, openness versus protection. Group 3, novelty versus predictability. And group 4, public versus private. Take about 8 or 9 minutes to talk about this tension, some examples of this tension, and be prepared to share some of the things that came up in your discussion.
Yes, yes.
Your own words, but.
Unless somebody's.
Yeah, you can get hurt. It can go wrong. All right.
Yeah. Share that. Like having somebody else. Do not want to happen.
My own handwriting.
Or, keep tight schedule, never. Yeah.
I said, how much you prepare yourself, just how much you're willing to do versus. Or
Asking an example of what this area pop up.
but keeping yourself guarded. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, one partner was super.
Yes.
One was-
Or the. Yeah. One partner is, schedule like, say, things out.
So it could be a conversation. But or maybe there's a picture you have. So one person wants to share, the other person doesn't. Yeah. And that would. Like an example. How do we mean? Like it, please.
So, how do you
Uh,
deal with this?
One is like I need to like be alone and independent, but also like I want to be with other people.
I was for me, it was definitely like just speaking to
Cool.
other people. I don't know.
I overshare everything.
Partners.
I think you're.
Everyone is.
Wow.
Not fucking crazy. Little life.
They also like filling your orange juice, whether that is like. Bingo.
We'll take a couple more minutes to continue discussing.
I'm so happy I was there. I probably did a video.
Very good. My God, I don't know. Even though it has one more. Oh, I think you said your time. Obviously.
Go ahead and wrap up your discussion. Is somebody ready to share?
I can't look at it and say. Now I can.
So I was just verifying the time and location. So if you're interested in hearing from a candidate for public relations, we'll be doing a talk about some of this research. He's actually going to be right here in this room starting at 2. So if you have a gap or want to hear what he has to say, you're just welcome to stick around here after class. It is Dr. Michael Nitz from Norwegian. He's professor of communication studies at Augustana University in South Dakota. Saw him share his teaching a little bit earlier as new stuff in TR2. So let's talk a little bit about some of the tensions that you all identified here. For the sake of time, why not have each group share an example that they came up with of this tension, how they might navigate this tension. So let's start here on the autonomy versus connection group. What was an example that came up for you all?
So the example we thought of is like a marriage, or, it's people getting married. It is sort of like two separate lives, but also like, they're living together, spending a lot of time together, so they have to deal with the tension of being around each other and dealing with the relationship, but also wanting to spend their own time alone and do their own things, be independent of each other.
Yeah, thanks, JP. Especially these past couple of years with COVID, right? A lot of people have had to do more work remotely, spend a lot more time in the same place. Some people have gotten sick of each other. There's a whole joke. There's a whole joke about how some people now discover how they take meetings. Like, I didn't realize that my partner was a let's circle back to this type of person, right? So sometimes spending more time with each other in close proximity can be a challenge there. It's about openness versus protection.
Basically, we just kind of talked about how you just need to actually communicate with each other.
Right.
You talk things out and have some common ground, and then maybe try asking more personal, in-depth questions to try to kind of break that turtle shell essentially and to really get to know the person.
Yeah, sometimes it can feel like we get into a pattern with each other, right? Where we say, hi, how are you? Good, how are you? Or like we wave to the same person every day and it doesn't really break past that, right? So sometimes having somebody take a risk or a step that goes beyond an established boundary is a way to move toward more open communication. Let's hear from the third group here on novelty versus predictability.
Okay, so for novelty, we said consider doing something spontaneous, and for predictability, we said doing something routine.
Yeah.
For how we deal with these things, don't plan or go with the flow or plan and calendar. And for 3 scenario, we said if one partner is spontaneous and laid back, whereas the other is schedule oriented and organized.
Yeah. So that can be a situation people have to navigate, right? Sometimes people are very live in the moment and more spontaneous. Other people are long-term planning oriented. One thing that does help in terms of navigating social needs, though, right, is the idea that while somebody leans toward one extreme and another leans toward the other, that allows that other side of somebody's needs to be met. Somebody could be a little bit more predictable or routine, but they enjoy doing something spontaneous. And they have a friendship or relationship leans a little bit more that way. And then lastly, public versus private.
We said just having a conversation that's private, you either want that to be private, obviously, or if it was kind of funny, you don't really care if it gets out, you share it.
Yeah, right. So the question of how seriously you take some type of disclosure or revealing of information is an example of that tension at play too, right? So for example, a week ago when we were in Salt Lake, my partner's family and her parents will post photos and tag them to social media that are just really bad photos of us, and we don't want them on social media. And I'm like, so that's why I have the thing where you have to approve when you're tagged, right? But there are some photos or information where it's fine where you're tagged. So a question of being tagged, permissions you have for tags, and so on might be an example of information that's public or private that you're comfortable with sharing. So again, I think this is a useful theory because we navigate and negotiate these tensions on a regular basis in our lives. So RDT, right, explains how we build relationships in terms of navigating and communicating in the context of those tensions. Sometimes we want both sides, sometimes we lean really hard. The cognitive dissonance that we might feel in our relationships, experiences, as we're navigating that seesaw. And then lastly, that these tensions really can form around a lot of the relationships and connections that we form with other people. So there are a lot of media and practical examples you could use here. This is a theory that stands out to you. On Wednesday, we'll be talking about cultivation theory, which gets into the role of media and power of media in terms of shaping our lives and how we think about a variety of events. So have a great rest of your Monday. You're welcome to pass forward your group activity if you haven't done so already. If you'd like to see our peer candidate, he'll be here next. Feel free to stick around. Otherwise, have a great rest of your afternoon. Wednesday.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.